not really like to present that. I mean, I dipped into it, but it might have a discussion. I don't know if you would do that.
Some of the stories. Some of the stories.
I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm going to keep my introduction quite brief because my colleague has a fairly long paper, no longer than Matt Bruce's last night, but certainly long enough. I just want to say Alexandra Pârvan is senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology at the University of Pitești in Romania. The rest of the details of her biography are there in your packets, and our online registrants also have access to that online. I just want to say that theologians spend a lot of time talking together in praise of interdisciplinarity and praise it as a goal that we should all be striving for. And yet, whenever there is a job search up and running and people are looking at candidates, they want people who look exactly like them, by which I mean in terms of discipline. And thus they preserve the balkanization of our disciplines. Our next speaker is interdisciplinary by nature. This is a person who has degrees in psychology, in philosophy, who has written award-winning poetry on a national level in Romania, but also received prizes for poetry in the Netherlands and in the UK. An unusual theologian to be sure, but I welcome her now to our lectern. Alexandra Pârvan.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for those who are still here. Bruce said my paper is long, so I'm going to make my time even longer because I want to say a few extra things before I start reading. I was thinking after all these days and last evening's reception that I think it is fitting that I close this conference for many reasons, but I will give you three. We have heard papers dedicated to various theologians, aside from and in relation to Barth, but none of those theologians was Bruce McCormack. My paper deals with his work at a conference held partly in his honor, and maybe in future there will be a conference here themed Barth and McCormack. Second, my paper is a demonstration of all that was said of him last evening, that he is a risk-taker, generous, of a voracious mind, ready to form mutually enriching intellectual partnerships, such as with Dr. Gaventa, and all those good things. And here is why this paper is a demonstration of all these things. And here's how I come to the third point. The Romantics were intensely rebellious and revolutionary artists. Their works were not meant to please or bring comfort, but to disquiet, to shatter the foundation under your feet, because, well, you can only fly if you lift your feet off the solid ground. So my constructive critique of his work is done in the Romantic spirit, so fasten your seatbelts, and because he is the person and scholar we all heard last night that he is, and we know that he is, he graciously endures everything that I have to say. So if at some point during my reading you are too disquieted and start to dislike me, remember that he likes me. And he welcomes this kind of formative, creative intrusion into the universe of his always open mind. So now let's get to the task. Just a second. So the paper is called Reformed and Romantic Kenoticism, the Old, the New, and the Novel, or How to Paint the Bird in Flight. It is to be hoped that we all have something of the romantic in our blood, writes Barth in what I deem a perplexing conclusion to his chapter on romantic poet novalis. He had used 42 pages up to that final passage to purposefully argue the contrary, that Reformed theology has left or should leave behind the heritage of Romanticism. I disagree with him on the matter of what that heritage is, as I do with his treatment of both Romanticism and Novalis, but then my general finding is that in theological works, there are many ways to misconstrue Romanticism. For that reason, the first part of this paper is dedicated to succinctly describe it in order to then introduce my notion of post-Romantic theology. In the second part, I will show what Romanticists can give to the Reformed Kenoticism of one post-Romantic theologian, Bruce McCormack. Romanticism was a literary movement that erupted in both England and Germany in 1798 and spread vigorously throughout the whole of Europe and both Americas, generating works during the following 90 years. Even though it did not appear out of nothing, being prefigured by several decades of pre-Romanticism, when it did eventually explode, it marked a cultural rupture. It changed the content, form, language, nature, and purpose of literature, and through it all, the expression of human identity and faculties, the human situation in history, society, and nature. Its earthquake waves spread through the visual arts and music, history, philosophy, economy, social theory, state theory, jurisprudence, as well as natural sciences, influencing the way biology, physics, chemistry, or medicine were understood, approached, and practiced. Due to its nature as a protestatory event that proclaimed freedom from any conventions, Romanticists set the prototype of the artistic avant-garde. I believe it was also due to its resolute anti-conventionalism, as well as to its geographical and time spread, that Romanticists took diverse expressions in specific national, political, historical, and cultural contexts. Yet, despite its shape-shifting character, there remains a recognizable romantic aesthetic, sensibility, rhetoric, and literary typology, as has been convincingly argued. Here, my reflections draw in particular on the German, English, and Romanian Romantics, but along with, say, Novalis, the Schlegel brothers, Hölderlin, Byron, Shelley, or Eminescu, a host of authors from different parts of the Romanticism map have informed my thinking. Among them are Edgar Allan Poe, Ugo Foscolo, Georges Sand, and Lermontov. In addition, manifestos of Romanticism were written also in France and Italy by various authors, for instance, Madame de Staël, Hugo, or Manzoni, all of whom have contributed to the definition of Romanticism and to my comprehension of it. So what was this unprecedented poetic revolution about? Romanticism was rooted in a vehement polemic against the aesthetics of the 17th century artistic classicism. As I go on to describe both classicism and Romanticism, I invite you to carry out in your mind a parallel between these two artistic universes and two forms of doing theology, one that follows a tradition, whether classic or reformed, and one that moves away from it to establish its own coherent and new ground. Throughout the paper, the words art and artistic creation will refer almost exclusively to poetry and literature. So here we go. Classicism was characterized by the strict submission of artistic creation to norms or rules of composition, many of which were set by Aristotle. by a rigid and obligatory formal discipline, a respect for order, symmetry, clarity, certitude, proportion, good taste, cultivated expression. Art was canonical, and in virtue of this constitutional quality, classic art was proclaimed to be the only valid one, regardless of time or space. Classicism was an art of perfection and claiming itself to be perfect. It was oriented towards the general, the abstract, the immutable, and I could even say the impossible, insofar as it did not want to stir the spirits, to generate doubt or awaken discontent in audiences. It preferred a pre-established order of things, and all that was asked of the artist was conformity to this order and the skill of a craftsperson in order to create in accordance with indisputable norms considered impossible of betterment. In contrast, the Romantics associated perfection with limitation. Because it is closed on itself, classic poetry is finite, and it is also descriptively static, marked by fixity. Classic art looks backwards, towards the past, as does any system considered perfect, complete in itself, self-sufficient, irreformable, unalterable, and the culmination of all previous efforts throughout the ages. Any system is repugnant to the Romantic spirit because it is closed and thus cannot tend towards the infinite. It involves the mechanical, the simple, the pure, the hierarchical, the conventional, the discursive, all of which are incapable of rendering the spirit of literature. The latter knows no artificial delimitations, traverses all genres, and binds them together to reflect the complex, the organic, the real, the natural of both life and art. The Romantics sought to express a reality of less clear contours, one that cannot be strictly delimited, and reached for different unity in their art, one more fluent, tuneful, more spontaneous, allowing for the unknown, and thus always open and permeable to the infinite and its mystery. They liberated the poetic conscience of any restrictions and confinements that would compromise the livingness of art and the autonomy of inspiration. The mystery of poetry and its revelatory nature are incompatible with rules and canons, they thought. When they rejected a prideful stationing within the limits of pre-established formulas, they made permanent renewal to be art's very principle of existence. And so, Romanticism is an open model, an art of open forms. It is in continuous development, limitless, free, alive as life itself is alive, never perfected or finished such that it could be dissected as a dead object. It looks ahead, progressing towards a constantly renewed future. The Romantics then rebelled against the outdated classical canon, against tradition and authority. They abolished the tyranny of classic Aristotelic rules of composition that imposed artificiality on the work of art. The general, the abstract were abandoned for the particular, the individual, the concrete, the historical, the relational, the complex, the alive, the moving. The bird was painted in flight. My intuition is that the Romantic rebellion against regulated ways to think and create has moved from literature into the field of theology from the dusk of Romanticism, late 19th century onwards, and it is active and still happening. What I will call the post-Romantic theologians no longer adopt a strict discipline of doing theology, following rules of reasoning, often also set by Aristotle, and leading to canonical thinking, considered the only one valid. They feel comfortable with blurred contours and impure categories. They are not troubled that God could be composite instead of simple, could be mutual and passible, or that humility, death, and suffering can belong to the divinity itself. The thinking about God is released from technical, long-established, borrowed norms of reasoning or conventions that are set theoretically and are not sufficiently apt to describe the reality under investigation. Words like revelation, livingness, the real, the concrete, replace the descriptively static and fixed accounts of God. this romantic God can no longer be dissected. His actions in the world, his movements are to be observed like the bird in flight. Just like Romantic literature, this theology looks towards the future, not the past. Back to is never a good slogan, warned Barth. And it is free and creative insofar as it rejects the prideful stationing within limited, well-defined, pre-established formulas and accepts a constant development or a state of perpetual becoming. The most positive statements of dogmatics, thought Barth, quote, can themselves only be new questions. If the questioning ceased, then dogmatics would be at an end, end quote. Like Romanticists, this kind of theology too is an enterprise of producing open forms because, as Bruce McCormack likes to say, there is no irreformable teaching. Of the several significant traces left by Romanticism in Reformed theology, which I see as very much alive and at work today, and are not yet properly acknowledged, I will stop to mention just one, a new discourse on affectivity. In Romanticism, affective states are exacerbated and passions are promoted as a poetical source in order to right an injustice and restore the human being to its natural and structural integrity, denied in classicism and the Enlightenment by the excessive reign of reason. I believe it was because Romanticists brought to the fore and resignified states that oppose the invariable serenity, balance, and order valued by classicists that troubled affectivity could coherently enter theological discourses as states other than serenity and eternal bliss began to be seen as compatible with and even indispensable to God's divinity. The Romantics have offered a way to look at suffering and exaggeratedly passionate states as being elevating rather than debilitating, showing that clear-headed, impassible states or rational emotions are not the only ones in agreement with the purposes of reason. That intense passions, when not experienced as an end in themselves, instead of weakening or opposing reason, are enhancing it or are opening it up to a more complete mode of operation where it can accomplish better its purpose. All of this is found in the God who suffers too. He is made whole and elevated, not weakened, in suffering with Jesus rather than remaining impassible. He does it intentionally, quite reasonably, and not as an end in itself, because the purpose of incarnation, which is not suffering, is accomplished in it. In short, for God to suffer and be passible without losing anything of his godly being, he had to be rid of the bondage to philosophically acceptable emotional states, such as joy and happiness, and quite a different connection between reason and passions had to be conceived, and that connection was made by the Romantics. Moving on to the second part of this paper, I start by noting two things. That McCormack's innovations in Kenoticism are romantic in character and that they are held back by his bondage to classic traditional ways of thinking that are incompatible with them. I therefore see him as caught between the old and the new that he wants to shape, such that his theory is prevented from fulfilling its insight and remains entangled in a net of unsolvable paradoxes and conflicts. Here are some of them. Are you ready? For McCormack, God is no longer a substance. He is a subject, but he still has an essence, and he is still immutable. God is not simple because he has a body. Incarnation is not optional, and Jesus is proper to the eternal identity of God's composite second person. Yet, in various ways, McCormack still speaks as though the Trinity would be divine only. For instance, as I have pointed out elsewhere, he frequently identifies the second person with the Logos alone. The Logos is the one generated for a telos, the one determined for incarnation, anticipating and then realizing it concretely, the one securing the unity of the person through his particular property of ontological receptivity, and the one who has a history that begins as divine and ends as human. Moreover, the Son is himself posited as divine only, strictly divine, despite continuously and eternally receiving ontologically the human properties of Jesus and taking all of Jesus' life up into his own. This not only is a paradox, but the very negation of reception. This ontological paradox is repeated at the level of knowledge and will. The Son's divine knowledge and acts of willing are illuminated through reception of the human modes of knowing and willing, but at the same time, the Son does not receive something that he did not already possess through his divine knowledge. But there can be no reception if what is received was already known. Reception also means movement, because the human life moves in Jesus as well as into and inside the Son. If the human is proper to the eternal identity of the second person, who is as composite as McCormack says, then the Trinity is not divine only, and it is also not immutable, because God is also always also human, and the human Jesus is mutable. Moreover, McCormack clearly affirms a relation of God not just to Jesus but to the world in Jesus, when in fact immutability in the received classical definition prevents that. Such a relation would introduce accidents in God, making him dependent on something external and temporal, and hence making him mutable. Finally, the God of Chalcedon was built in the classical tradition, and McCormack departs drastically from it. His God is not simple, not impassible, not outside time, history, suffering, and death, not unrelated to the world. He's always also human. He actually has flesh. And he also receives the humanity within his divinity. Therefore, to me, McCormack's Kenoticism can repair Chalcedon about as much as Romanticism can be said to have repaired classicism by setting a bomb underneath its neat and tightly structured system. It is more accurate to say that in sheer romantic spirit, his kenotic Christology advances an altogether different creed. A strong bond that keeps McCormack trapped in the old is the inherited classic language. After the Romantics, one can no longer be unaware that to offer something new in old language is to half fail. They were the first to understand that a new way to conceive reality requires the invention of a new language, and opposing the classic use and classic theory of language as a mere instrument, they advanced the idea of poetic language as expression. Language is no longer employed as an analytic inventory of figures that underline the oratorical message. It is the real and truthful expression of a lived state of being that is relational par excellence. The poem communicates the poet's self in its process of communicating with nature and attaining through this uniting a higher supersensible reality. The identity between word and ultimate reality is achieved only in expression, as other forms of communication cannot surpass the divide between life and speech. According to both the Romantics and contemporary literary theory, expression or expressivity, I'll use these two terms interchangeably, is a manner of communicating that is eminently communicative of its content, insofar as it covers the content's multiple dimensions and values and makes possible a reception that is immediate, powerful, deep, truthful, and for all these reasons, I would add, most complete. Now, transferring this in theology, in God, life and word are identical. There is no divide between his word and his godly reality. This reality is efficiently and fully communicated in godly word. God is always relation inside the Trinity, and relation entails self-communication between the related terms. Each one communicates oneself to the one at the other end. McCormack struggles with what term would be suitable enough to refer to the Trinitarian persons, and is unsure of Barth's option for Seinweisen, modes of being. I note that all these three terms, mode, being, and mode of being, carry a heavy philosophical heritage in their origin, nature, history, and the varied meanings assumed over centuries. They are a residue of the old. I therefore want to propose a new term, and speak of the triune God in his three life expressions, rather than three persons: Father, Son, Jesus, and Spirit. These three units do not formulate or express partially or imperfectly an ontological content that lies deeper and remains silent, that pre-exists or is more basic than their expression. In poetry, too, expression does not merely render or represent something already fully shaped. It is formative. It constitutes the reality of what is communicated. Expression is God's self-constitution as triune. It makes be. It is not a partial bringing out, limited by the possibilities of speech, of something that is already there. As triune, God is relation and therefore communication and therefore expression. He presses himself out, which is the Latin meaning of the word expression, to take out by pressing, exprimo. God is in himself a pressing out, a being towards his own self, but also the other, the human Jesus, who in this movement is made God's self. A person can rest in oneself, expression cannot. The romantic new way of being in the world that required a new manner of writing and consequently the renewal of language was founded on a new manner of feeling. Affectivity is exalted, and the poet no longer writes on the topic of one or other type of emotion, producing a copy of an already given model. The Romantics communicate feelings as they are alive in them, thereby creating the language of affects, at once an aesthetic and human conquest. Intellectual content does not need expressivity in order to be communicated in full or better, more clearly. But the language of logic will never be able to communicate what Lord Byron says with "she walks in beauty, like the night." Where affection is not involved, expression is not needed, and expressivity is multidimensional. It communicates not just the affective and the cognitive, but also the volitional, the axiological, the aesthetic, and I would personally add the corporal, the somatic. It is intentional, and as such entails involvement, commitment. Its creator is not indifferent. She wants to influence the audience and guide it towards her intended meaning. Moreover, in expression, her own attitude towards that which is communicated, as well as her own individuality, are also communicated. And because expression is not reducible to the transmission of informational content or data, it can never be possessed by the receivers. The ones receiving it cannot control it, alter it, assume it, fully explain it, distort it, or fully consume it. Expression remains alive and active and independent, and continues to work in the receiver, pushing her to seek deeper, to discover new aspects of that expression, new ways to look at it. As a brief illustration of all I said thus far about expression, consider this short passage in Shelley, where the poet addresses the west wind, which, as ever in Romanticism, is not merely a physical reality. Oh, lift me as a wave, lift a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life. I bleed. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? In their uniting, the poet and the west wind both transform and reach another, higher reality or state of being. The expression conveys passion, will, values, attitude, selfhood, purpose, a strong bodily feel, the bleeding, a sense of beauty, a view of existence, a sense of destiny, connectedness, involvement with the cause of humankind, and the poet's call to the audience to embrace transformation. And evidently, the expression retains intrinsic vitality, as the mystery of the poet's word is both eminently conveyed and preserved, at once revealed and veiled. All these qualities apply to God's expressing of himself. His self-constitution as expression is unique, not replicable, original, intentional, not indifferent, committed to the purpose of revealing both what is expressed and the one expressing it, which in God are one and the same. It seeks to make its content accessible, visible, understandable in the way its creator wants or intends it. It is oriented towards its addressee. It guides the receiver towards the conveyed and intended meaning. And it has all the dimensions entailed by expression, including the corporal, because God is also flesh. He is the human Jesus no less than he is all else that he makes himself be. God expresses himself as human body and therefore has something to communicate that involves this level too. Understanding God's self-constitution as expression collides with Barth's view on God's self-revealing by way of dicere, speech. That is because Barth limits God's word to reason alone, to the communication of God's thoughts. The truth of God is restricted to intellectual content, and God's word is reduced to communicate only such content. There are innumerable problems with the claim that God is word or speech or truth that wants to be known by thinking. First, incarnation is made useless, and the flesh of God irrelevant, because divine reason can communicate directly with human reason without taking up human flesh. Flesh cannot facilitate a revelation of reason, quite the contrary. Then, in incarnation, Jesus is made incapable to be the one where God self-reveals, because the divine word, defined as reason, cannot even communicate the truth of human life, let alone the truth of superhuman life, which is exactly what the Romantics have amply and eminently shown. In addition, everything that Jesus is as does, starting with his flesh and ending with the cross, as well as scripture itself, can in no way be equated with a discourse of reason. When Barth holds that Deus Dixit speaks only of the divine, is meant to reveal only the divine, and is directed only to the humans, and hence that through Jesus, God speaks only of a divine Trinity, the implications are these. Jesus is made a mere medium for a strictly divine revelation and not part of the Trinity himself. And God's revelation cannot actually be self-revelation in Jesus if the Trinity is wholly divine. Further still, if revelation is divine reason communicating with human reason, that makes God himself irrelevant, because human reason does not need a God. A professor of philosophy will suffice. But then it is not, I can tell you that, but as a philosopher, but then it is not by extending our reason to its maximum reach that we become able to believe, love, or even know completely. We are helped towards that just because God's word is expressive, which means it uses and transgresses the possibilities of reason-based speech to address our whole human being, not just our reason, and to communicate the whole God, not just his reason. Moreover, if God self-reveals in Jesus, then God speaks not only of the divine and not only to humans. God expresses himself as the human Jesus too, and he speaks to Jesus too. There is expressivity inside the Trinity, and Jesus reveals God as also human and as relation to the human. I think that in stripping God's word of the expressivity it possesses in Jesus, in God the Son, and in Scripture, Barth loses the Christian God altogether in his Dicere argument. Moreover, a further reason McCormack has to drop his commitment to Barth's Dicere is that it makes the Son's receptivity impossible. Barth restricts the divine Son, the Word of God, to reason, logos, thought. But as word of reason, he cannot receive Jesus' feelings and life events. In receptivity, the Son lives with Jesus always before and after he is born, and even in his death, as the otherness of human life in its entirety is allowed to be not only with the Son, but within his divinity. This speaks of the Son's uprootedness, anticipating, reaching towards to receive the other inside himself, yet without losing himself. It speaks of his self-humbling, self-limitation, or suffering that even leads the divine to experience death as his own. No word of reason can ever explain all this. In proper romantic vein, in McCormack's Kenoticism, the unity of the Christic person, secured in the son's receptivity, is not achieved rationally, but affectively. The Romantics understood that only affective unity defeats the conceptual separation between beings of distinct kinds or between beings and things, and can bring about ontological unity. They place receptivity at the core of their selves. Through receptivity to nature, the romantic spirit achieves emotional unity with it, and in and through that emotional unity, the romantic reaches a higher unity and a higher level of being together, namely with a non-physical, super-intellectual, super-sensible, all-pervasive spirit of life. A similar dynamic is present in McCormack's kenosis. There is ontological unity inside the second person because there is affective unity and through affective unity. For McCormack, receptivity is possibility, and it is in possibility, in feeling, that ontological unity is achieved. And that is why he specifically states that, quote, taking all that Jesus did and experienced and therefore is up into the son's own life, has an effect precisely on the level of affectivity, and through that on ontological level. Sorry, the quote ended a little bit earlier, but this is still his thought. He would agree. And I would say that here too, I forgot to end the quote. Receptivity. So through that, sorry, let's go again. He specifically states that this is the quote: "Taking all that Jesus did and experienced, and therefore is up into his own son's own life," end quote, has an effect precisely on the level of affectivity, and through that on ontological level. And now I quote again: "Receptivity renders the being of a God affective, and therefore it is therefore an ontological receptivity." End quote. And I would say that here too, in the Christic uniting, a higher level of unity is reached, namely the unity that is God's life in the entire Trinity, because the being together of the Son, Jesus, is at the same time godly being. In what follows, I want to use the romantic understanding of receptivity in order to deepen and expand McCormack's intuitions about divine receptivity and grant them more freedom and coherence away from the rigid thought schemata. The first thing that I want to say is this: because receptivity is possibility, it is also passivity. Possibility, passibilis, and passivity, passivus, are both derived from pati or pati. To suffer, to endure, to bear, to allow, to submit. To be passive is to suffer an action, an emotion, or simply to be capable of suffering. And to be passible is to be subject to or capable of suffering, feeling, emotion. The God of classical theism, understood as divine only and under the conditions of perfection established by classic metaphysics, can be neither passible nor passive. He cannot be acted on, whether it is by way of emotion or action. The God that McCormack speaks of is acted on through receptivity, but is recognized only as possible, not also passive. It is again a residue of the old classic divine ontology that McCormack feels the idea of divine passivity and is very quick to specify that, quote again, "This receptivity is not passivity. It is an exercise of the power employed by the Logos in weakness," end quote, which is just what receptivity is, he adds. However, because McCormack radically changes the God concept, he need no longer be bound by the old metaphysical definitions. Otherwise, it would be simply absurd to speak of a God who is immutable, but not also impassible, and who is possible without being passive. The romantic method of attuning the poet's self to the reality of nature in order to communicate nature's voice to the others and also to find its reality within the self was referred to as receptive passivity or simply receptivity. In receptivity, the poet is typically portrayed on heights, standing still and looking at the swarm of natural and human life from high up, or else at a lakeside, withdrawn in himself, seemingly focused on his interior states, immobile, inactive. In this state, he surrenders the self to the flux of the external natural world, which impresses itself on the poet, he thus becomes able to vibrate deeply to its hidden resonances, to hear the most obscure signals of nature, to express the most subtle or enigmatic intimations of life. It occurs to me that this combination of passivity, receptivity, and passibility could be called the Romantic Kenosis. And there is one more crucial element to it. Passivity, receptivity, and passibility make creativity possible. The capacity to create thus gained is applied to formulating the poet's self, nature's voice, and the poem, all of which get their expression. This method and its finality are recognizable in McCormack's kenotic process too. The divine sign is receptive and acted upon by the human Jesus, whose life enters the Son, and in this, several things are achieved. First, his own specific formulation or definition as Son, who is at all times both himself and more than himself, divine but never strictly divine in the sense of an insulated divinity, which is why I said in previous work that in receiving Jesus, he transforms without losing what defines his form. Then, the unity of the divine and the human as the two sides speak in the same voice. And then, through their union, a great work is accomplished, which is given to the world. And insofar as in being receptive, the Son expresses his way to be, he is, of course, not simply passive or inactive. Thus, a first thing that romantic receptivity teaches us is that one needs to be passive to go beyond oneself. There is no room left for the other if you are always active. And if you always act, you are self-centered, and you impose yourself and your power on things and people. Nothing gets from you to me if I always take positive action and I'm never in attentive and receptive passivity. If I speak all the time, I never listen. In fact, when I utter words, I cannot breathe in, I can only breathe out, which means that if I were to speak all the time, I would die by suffocation, basically suffocated in and by my own words. Aside from the method of contemplation just described, the Romantics have exercised and perfected passive receptivity in their intense explorations and experiences of sleeping, laziness, or idleness, and the sense of death and dying. All of which states are pulverizing the ego, the self-centering, the limits of the self, and the focus on the self's acting, and therefore the self's expressing of itself alone and not also of the other, of something more and different than the self. The romantic passive states are also exploratory in character and reflect a distinct epistemic method. The romantics sought to know not just with their intellect, but with their entire being. They sought to know also with the unknown in them, with the most obscure territories and faculties of being. They sought a knowing that is more characteristic to life, more natural, pure, one that would unite them with the organic whole of life, one that bore the creative magic force of life itself, and could redeem, reveal, save. In this passive receptive state, the romantic deems her ego and escapes the grip of reason. She lets her defenses down and opens the gate to the unknown. She walks on uncertain, insecure, unpleasant, troublesome, even perilous ground to find that part in her that is more her own self than her consciousness is. There, she reaches the attunement of exterior and interior life rhythms and accesses the higher level of the real, which is not externally given. It is not a physical reality. I have discussed in published work how in McCormack the Son knows Jesus more fully than just by intellect. McCormack speaks of the self-illumination brought about by the Son's experience of what Jesus knows, wills, does, lives, and I myself have used the word transformation. Consider, for instance, that a receptivity allows him to have corporal knowing, even though he does not have a body, insofar as the body belongs to Jesus. The Son, too, in being passively receptive, walks into the unknown on foreign perilous territory up to his own experience of death, and this explorative and receptive enterprise transforms his strictly divine regime of experience. In his eternal reception of Jesus, the Son knows also in the not knowing, just as the Romantics have attempted. In Romanticism, what gives access to this knowledge in and with the unknown, what makes one see within the unseen, is feeling. Without it, without possibility, the crepuscular states of passive receptivity would remain as epistemically dry and blind as the clear reason is. The immensely valuable thing that the Romantics teach us is that reason is opaque. Consider for a moment the difference between reasoning about love and living it. Have you considered it? The Romantics immersed in feeling as into a dimension that opens the gates of vision, makes one visionary. Consequently, a well-ingrained fear of theologians, which in Barth becomes a charge against theological romanticism, can be dispelled. A romantic feeling is not a sinking into a purely psychological, strictly individual experience that closes the subject into one's self and away from the secure, certain, and objective path of reason. Approached in the romantic method, intense emotion makes one see because its purpose is always beyond itself and never in the actual object. This emotion is the intentional golden path towards that super intellectual and super sensible knowledge that cannot be possessed merely by reason and hence is not strictly theoretical, but constitutes an experience of lived life at its purest and most complete level. The spiritualized affection that gives access to the highest level of reality brings about a larger and fuller rationality, one that exceeds the confines of reason. Being boundless, feeling is a medium far more capable than the limited reason to both capture and express the infinite. And the fact that this all-consuming feeling is expressed, namely communicated in the way it can be best received in others, is another indication that it frees the romantic from the cage of subjectivity and makes possible an experience that far transcends personal biography. All romantic goals, transformation, creation, transsubjective union, are self-decentered and oppose a reduction to the individual self or personal experience. A further reason not to fear the word passivity and resist applying it to the divine is that there is an element of passivity in love too. Love is a receptive state. Love as sheer activity would be just forceful imposing of self on the other, more like a conquest or an invasion than love. If God is love, he must listen, not just speak. He must be attentive, receptive. Seeing God as expression recognizes his intrinsic and complex affectivity. That is to say, the being of God is not rendered effective just by the Son's receptivity. Before human emotion and suffering enters the divine Son, God's being is effective in a manner that does not reduce him to the sterilized, philosophically valid, reasonably acceptable, strictly positive, and static emotions such as perfect love or bliss. I have discussed in previous work the range of emotions that can be considered present in the Son, but God the Father too would be troubled because love is trouble. He cannot be free and unconditioned if he loves, if he is love. He would be pained and concerned for his Son if not for us. He would care, and care is never peaceful. Paul Tillich speaks of religion as unconditional concern in human beings. I think the unconditional concern is God's in the first place. His concern is without condition, or in fact, it is conditioned on his love. He loves, therefore, he is conditioned to be concerned. A second relevant thing that romantic receptivity can offer to McCormack's Kenoticism, aside from the importance of passivity, is that receptivity produces an effect not just in the receiver, but also in the one that is received, as well as in their relation and union. In the kenotic relation, as described by McCormack, the Son alone is a receiver and Jesus alone is the actor. Communication is unidirectional from Jesus to the Son, for McCormack fears that any traffic in the reverse direction would entail the overpowering and annihilation of human capacities. I think this need not necessarily be the case, but I want to address now a different point. If nothing passes from the Son to Jesus, then the latter is isolated in his suffering and trouble, no matter how much of his turmoil the Son receives in his divinity. If Jesus does not know himself to be received, then this is simply one other way to expel him from the Trinity, to cut off the relation with him and segregate him in his human condition. Of course, this is not what McCormack wants to say. But if Jesus knows that God is with him and not as some separate entity from him, if he knows and feels that ultimate concern of an affective God and Father, then something passes from the Trinity to him. Moreover, if the Son receives Jesus, it is not because the latter is confiscated without his knowledge or assent, as though the divine would vampirize an unaware, unwitting, and unwilling human. Jesus for sure wants to communicate his life to the Son, knows that he is received, feels that he is loved, and acts in full knowledge of that. In Romanticism, receptivity does not remain unanswered. The poet is receptive to nature, and in its turn, nature engages its receiver, responds to the poet's passive and intensely receptive presence, reflects the affective state of the poet, and thus their unity is reached between them, and not just in one member of the relation, as in McCormack's kenosis. Again, I see it useful to think of the Son's receptivity and Jesus' activity more romantically, which means less rigidly, less fearful of transfers, and less quick to draw strict contours, to clearly separate, dissociate, confine, and distinguish what belongs only to one side or the other, because to isolate the actions of the two terms in a relation is, after all, to destroy the relation. A lot as a psychologist, I can tell you that. Yeah. So a lot in a relation is built or arises directly in between and not exclusively in one member or the other, or from their isolated powers. Considering this, I want to speak of an engaging on the part of Jesus of the Son's receptivity. The latter is receptive, and Jesus is engaging that receptivity as a response to it or to its being there. He is responsive to the presence, love, support, and the passive and passive receptivity of the Son, which allows him to act on the divine. His actions and acting on the Son are a response and in response to divine receptivity. Jesus is engaging of divine receptivity, or his responsiveness to it means that he acts as himself, but also as one who knows that he is received, which is to say that he acts in awareness of the relation and the uniting with the Son. He acts from the powers of that union, even as he acts only as human being. Engaging also means that Jesus acts for the Son, insofar as he knows his events and life are received into the divine, and that he is with the Son, just one and the same life expression of God. He knows that what he does, what he goes through, what he feels and suffers, his struggle and his search, as well as his joy or satisfaction, his contentment or resignation, and throughout all, his mission are not his alone. This means that in and by his very receiving, the Son acts on Jesus. And here the paradox of love appears again. Acting out of love or gratefulness or duty, for that matter, is never sheer activity. As in any good relation, neither Jesus's nor the Son's are sheer actions or sheer passivity. In communicating himself to the Son, Jesus is not performing a self-centered act of self-affirmation. First, because he is engaging the Son's receptive call to him as a way of giving back, and not as a self-imposing giving. And second, because he is also responsible for us, insofar as it is not his mere individual experience that he communicates to the Son. It is a trans-individual experience that speaks of us too, of our human life. Jesus is engaging of the Son's receptivity means that inside the Trinity, he too has his own property. The Son no longer looks like he alone is the second person, because his own specific property, ontological receptivity, cannot secure by itself the Christic unity. And so on the one side of the relation, we have receptivity, passivity, passibility, receptive activity, and transformation. On the other side, engaging, responsiveness, acting on, communicating, performative activity as ways of giving back or meeting the other. And between the two sides, unity. and through and in that unity, the living of God's larger life. Finally, all I said thus far brings to the fore another self-defeating inheritance of the old in McCormack. His concept of the subject is a classic one and conflicts with and sabotages his own innovations. He defines a divine subject as a rational agent of will activity, a thinking actor. Thus, reason, thought, will, agency, activity, that is all that enters the definition of God as subject. And that is precisely how the subject is traditionally defined in the disciplines that created and built the concept, philosophy and later psychology, namely a rational agent where rationality is reduced to reason, itself reduced to scientific logical thinking. This logocentric subject is atemporal, ahistorical, asocial, non-corporal, disengaged from any lived experience, any interrelationality or the fundamental relationality of life. All of this stands in contradiction with the novelty of McCormack's God concept. Etymologically speaking, to be either passive or passible is to submit to something other. But the same meaning is captured in the word subjectus. To be a subject is, this is Latin, right? Is to subjectus is to lie down and or stand under in a way that can signify one or several of the following: passivity, submission, surrender, humility, subordination, illness, death. In classical ontology, all these elements have no place in God, who in addition, being simple, cannot be conceived as a subject, as one who subsists or stands under such that various attributes would exist in him, right? Instead, all the mentioned qualities and states denoted by the word subject are coherent for McCormack's Kenoticism, especially as developed here from Romantic insights. The Romantics have rebelled against the severely partial subjectivity centered in a rationality that is grounded in and guaranteed by reason alone. Such subjectivity excludes a host of capacities and states that lie outside the reach of scientific reason: imagination, creativity, dream, inspiration, intuition, feeling, desire, emotion, values, the lived body, even the unreasonable, the unknown, the mad. All these aspects work together to create in each individual a larger, more significant and farther-reaching rationality that, along with a very concrete and intensely lived insertion in history and society, defines the Romantic subject. I believe crucial traits of the Romantic rationality and subjectivity, such as passivity, relationality, complex affectivity, corporality, mystery, creativity, historicity, and relation to the world, should not be missing in McCormack's definition of God as subject. After all, there is nothing rational in a narrow logocentric sense about a God that is receptive, relational, fleshy, humbling, suffering, and loving. If God is to be called a subject at all, he is one because he expresses life at its fullest, not because he is reason acted out. Or if you wish, his reason and agency are driven by and part of a broader and intrinsically expressive rationality. In closing, McCormack's Kenoticism needs a new creed to fully and coherently realize its creative intuitions. It is perhaps proper to call it the Princeton Creed, because this is the place where he produced his life work, where he learned from me 9 years ago that he is of Romantic spirit, and where I'm now suggesting its formulation as a clear and decisive departure from Chalcedon. Yet, whatever it would be called, this will be for sure a creed of Romantic imprinting, put to use in ways that are novel in theology, but that I consider essential to McCormack's kenotic model. First, because of its intrinsic affinity with Romanticism, and then because this model needs the Romantic transfusion, or should I say the east wind, to disentangle itself from old conceptual and linguistic ties and perform its inborn flight. Thank you.
Could I just say before opening the floor for questions that one of the things I have appreciated most about my friend Alexandra's criticisms of my work through the years is that she fully engages my work and understands it from the inside in a way that I would describe as impeccable. She really works from the inside, and her criticisms arise from within, as I think you would have sensed. And those in my life who have tried to make my work better by entering into it and saying, okay, I see what you're trying to do. Here's how I think it could be improved. Here's how I think it would be better. John Bolin has done that for me. There have been others, but it's in that spirit, I think, that this criticism, which is quite fundamental, has been offered. The floor is open for your questions. I see one back there.
Thank you, Dr. Pârvan. My name is Henry Burt. I'm a pastoral theology doctoral student here at Princeton, and I'm trying to approach this talk that you gave from an interdisciplinary standpoint too. My question, I think, follows off of what I'm pulling from Pamela Cooper White, who's a pastoral theology professor at Union Seminary. She wrote a book a few years ago called Shared Wisdom that looks at the role of God in a counseling relationship, particularly from a psychoanalytic standpoint. And at one point, Cooper White says, from a relational perspective, this fluid, multiple, dynamic God of love and compassion is to be found in the interstices and all the potential spaces of our domestic, pastoral, therapeutic, social, political, and institutional life. And finally, in the least expected places, even within the continents and internal spaces of our own selves. So I'm wondering what you've brought up with this notion of a receptive God. How, if God could even be understood in this counseling dynamic, say, between creation and counselor God, as in any way enacting countertransference, being in response to its creation. If there's that sort of dynamic going on, and if so, how to assess for that? How to basically my question is how to assess for God's receptivity to God's creation, and who has the authority to make those assessments? Is it something that the creation can glean and say, maybe even express through artwork, or is it really only God has God's handle on God's self? Or maybe it's a third person observer.
Yes, I'm not really sure I understood you correctly, but the receptive God is not mine, it's his. I don't want to speak of the God-human person's relation in terms of counter-transference or psychoanalysis. It's not my intention. I didn't want to say that work of art is an expression of God. So that was not what I meant to say. I'm not sure what to say, and I'm not exactly sure what's the question, but everything you said, I don't have a contact with, it's not my, I'm not there. It's not, the romantic view is not, I try to say that it's not a psychologizing view. It's on a different level, or metaphysical, if you want, ontological, but not in an abstract sense. In a spiritual sense, or in a sense where throughout a series of, a method of looking at life or understanding your person, of putting yourself in a relation, in that receptivity and feeling intensely, but as a method. So not just pathetic feeling, with a goal, with guided, right, and looking beyond feeling, beyond the object of your feeling. So this is why, especially the German Romanticism was called metaphysical. They are, but all of them. I mean, it's difficult now to make an assessment of the Romanticism. Was very diverse, and so, for instance, the American Romanticism was not metaphysical at all, more pragmatic and different. But so it's not, it's nothing. This the terms counter transfer. I even found it completely unsuitable. I mean, the first time, if I think of the psychological meaning of it, I'm already disturbed a little bit, because it's in transfer, right? The person you are counseling, so over sort of replaces the present relation with a different one. The relation with the therapist is automatically, unconsciously, mechanically. So I'm against romantics, or against mechanics and automatism, with another relation, which is problematic in their life. And then the counter transfer is that when the psychologist does the same, and I don't see at all how this, I mean, I don't want a God who has a counter transfer on me. And yeah, so. No.
Excuse me. Just an addendum, Henry. The book to which she's reacting is talking only about the God-Jesus relation, which distinguishes it dramatically from process theologies. I can easily imagine that when you hear words like dynamism and movement and all that, you easily think of process, but the differences are dramatic. I'm not talking in that book about a continuity of being between God and the world that sets up reciprocity, etc. There's none of that. It's just about God and Jesus.
That helps. Make it a lot.
I have a question, I think, from Beverly, and then I have an online question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your paper, which was very rich, and I think I need to read it about 5 times. And it may be that my question also is out of bounds, given what Bruce has just said. But it seems to me that there are real implications here for our understanding of faith, particularly for an understanding of faith that gets past a kind of rigid intellectualism and is capable of talking about faith among people who have severe intellectual disabilities,
Yes.
or dementia, or brain damage of various sorts. And I just wonder if I'm on the right track when I make
Yes.
that connection.
Yes, absolutely. I was, in fact, it wasn't my intention when I wrote this paper, but as I was writing it, because my mind works in various fields, and sometimes I cannot just block contents of it. And I was, they were just popping, just creeping in this connection with what happens in medicine. And so that a person now is no longer, I mean, you cannot think of a subject or a person as just being a rational agent, because then, I don't even think I'm a rational agent. I mean, I was telling Bruce a couple of days ago that I think 80% of our day is not rational at all. I mean, we just do things mechanically. We are on a schedule. We walk without thinking or looking, and we just get up, eat, walk, speak, sleep, and so on. And then we work apparently reflectively, but not a lot of what we do is very reflective, because it comes from all. It comes from a history of our reading, and from something that impacts you on a day, or a dialogue you had, or a mood you are in now. And so all of this is not really very, we are not in a test tube, right? And so, yes, and even this idea, I mean, there are many ideas now in this humanistic medicine, which basically reverse completely our understanding of what passivity, activity, subject the person is. And I was just, before coming here, I thought I would just would show you various artwork, but eventually, as Bruce said, the paper has gotten too long and there was no time. But if you think of Van Gogh's Sunflowers, I don't know if you know, or any of Van Gogh's work, those are dying flowers, but they are so beautiful. And millions of people are just going to see these dying flowers, and are filled with beauty. And the way he painted them, he's by the way, now I'm talking about one. He's the first one who, but is relevant, who painted faded flowers instead of flowers in full bloom, in their full, at the peak of their flowery existence. And so fading, they're dying, but they are so vibrant, they're moving, they are so the gold in them is captivating. It's simply something like drinking a lot of alcohol when you watch. And so that this life, a lot of life and energy, vitality, and the different understanding of life and what virtue is and what's the purpose of a human life, comes with being ill, when you are ill, and where you're in difficulty or with a disability. And then you find your humanity. And so many of these people are more able than us. And indeed, the fuller persons, or they are accomplished. They get accomplished in a way that the normally healthy don't get a chance to, because you don't think about it. You just, as I said, you forget, for instance, about your all the other bits. You retain your reason and will. You forget you have your body, that you have desires, the imagination. I don't know, that you want to. I want to dream for during the day, during this conference. I wanted to dream a bit, but it wasn't very easy to do because you can't just sit, stand, or walk around a bunch of people and be dreaming, and you would be thought awkward. So that's we miss out on all these aspects of our humanity. And I think already I've spoken too long for sure. But faith and intellectualism, faith never comes from a lot of reasoning. I mean, it's never the case. Can never be the case that even if you want to, I want to have faith. And now let's read and study for 30 years, and you wouldn't get to have it. So it doesn't mean that it's reason. I mean, I hope you've all understood that I'm not against reason, because I'm very. I mean, the mind is. The mind is important for me, and reasoning and clarity and conceptual thinking. But I think inspiration and intuition doesn't come from that alone. It needs emotion. I mean, everybody knows that. And intuition is considered the higher form of reason. So.
We have an online question, and I think we'll come to a conclusion with that question. Feeling is a mode of receptivity that is both receptive and unstable. If God is affective and affected, would you also wish to emphasize God's reliability and stability?
Yeah, for me, again, I mean, I'm now at a point in my life that I no longer like predefinitions. I mean, I'm a romantic now. I've always been, but now I'm more. I mean, middle-aged, and I care about nothing. I no longer care. And all these ideas about what stability, instability, or we are afraid that if he feels he might be unstable, what does it mean? And what does it all mean? To be stable, or if we say he's stable, then we say, oh, he's dead. This is not a feeling, God who cares, who can be close to me, or whom I can even conceive as being in any sort of relation with me, remote and cold and like Parmenides being. and which didn't do any other thing than to be. So that was just that. It was nothing else. But then the Christian God is a lot of movement inside God, right? A lot of, I'm afraid to say psychology, because then we are going into psychoanalysis again. But he's not tranquil. I don't see him as tranquil. It's a lot. This is a person, and a personality also. I mean, he thinks, he feels, he acts in certain ways. He has intentions. All of this is psychology in a sense, and this means movement, life. And if someone calls this instability, who cares? I mean, I don't care. You can, as I was saying before, we are just afraid of. Right? Patients are less than humans, are disabled, and we are able to. These are active and these are passive, and these are stable and these are unstable. It's not like that. And why are we so afraid that, if we say this, it means that he's unstable? And so what? I mean, who knows how he is? Nobody knows really. And it doesn't change anything. For me, the point is to keep trying to understand better, and to just not, bury your mind in, just like an object, right? And that's all. And whether you get it right or not, you will never know anyway. So. Yeah, maybe he's unstable. Good for him.
I'll bring this to a conclusion. I want to say one thing. I do have an ongoing concern myself with reliability in God because it affects trust. But having said that, those who think that Barth has a treatise on immutability when he talks about the constancy of God need to attend a little more closely to the German heading that governs that section. Constancy is a possible result of the kind of thing Barth's talking about, but the word he uses in German is Beständigkeit, and its fundamental meaning is persistence and perseverance. In what? In the covenant of grace. Okay, it's a lived relation. Is it stable? Well, God is constantly persistent and constantly perseveres in the covenant of grace. And if you want some hermetically sealed off immutability, then you're not talking about what Barth's talking about. Okay, enough said on that subject. I am grateful to all of you. This has been one of the most well-attended conferences we've had, second only to the one we invited Jürgen Moltmann to speak at. And we are grateful for our online registrants, and we are grateful to all of you who made the trip to Princeton to be here in person and to enjoy conversations around tables, etc. And I am personally grateful for those of you who attended the reception last night. I have to admit I was completely gobsmacked by it, but it was a real gift to me. So thank you all. Blessings on you in your travels. Thank you for being here.